Good morning. We're joined this morning. We'll start with Elizabeth May, who can maybe start by introducing the rest of her table mates. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci à tout le monde d'être ici avec nous pour cette conférence de presse tellement importante. We're here under the umbrella of Stop Canadian Involvement in Torture. My name is Elizabeth May. I'm the Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands. And it's my honor. I think I'll just do an introduction of the whole table, and then we'll go in the order in which people are seated. So the first speaker after me will be Sally Lane, author and mother of one of the Canadians detained in Syria, convicted of nothing, Jack Letts. Monia Mazigh is, I think, needs almost no introduction, human rights activist, extraordinary advocate, and author. Seated next to Monia, we have Tim McSorley from the Coalition for International Civil Liberties, en français, la Coalition pour la Surveillance Internationale des Libertés Civiles. Puis, pas le dernier, c'est Matthew Behrens from Stop Canadian Involvement in Torture, et quelqu'un bien connu, Alex Neve, l'ancien directeur de Amnesty International, mais maintenant professionnel en résidence à l'École supérieure d'affaires publiques internationale de l'Université d'Ottawa. I've relied on Alex for years for all things to do with human rights in Canada. His voice is extremely well-known, respected. And we, as Canadians, I will say briefly, so we can hear from everyone, that as a Canadian Member of Parliament, I am ashamed. I'm ashamed that my government has not done what other governments have done to take Canadian citizens, children, moms, and individual men who have not been convicted of anything, but who were caught up in the horrific events of terrorism in Syria and are being kept in horrific conditions. Canada recently made a good first step in deciding to repatriate some of the children, but there are 44 Canadians that we want brought home, and we'll talk about the details of that and take your questions. Mais maintenant, je vais donner la parole à Sally Lane. Sally, you have the floor. And just push the red button so you can be heard.
Oh, it's good. Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. My name is Sally Lane. My son Jack had his 27th birthday yesterday in a Syrian dungeon in conditions the UN has described as meeting the threshold for torture. I haven't seen him since he was 18 years old. This birthday is the 6th birthday he has woken up to the same nightmare of his unjust imprisonment without charge, not knowing how long his torment is going to last and believing the world has forgotten about him. Every night when I go to bed, I have to think of Jack lying on a concrete floor, as he has done for the past 5.5 years, going to sleep, hungry and in despair. I wonder if his kidney stones are giving him excruciating pain and whether he has managed to persuade the guards to get him medical treatment. I wonder if he has tried again to end it all, having lost all hope of release. In January 2018, Jack told a consular officer in Ottawa that he had tried to end his life because he believed this was preferable to his mother seeing him insane. How can any mother hear those words and not go insane herself? When I said this to Global Affairs Canada, they told me that the Canadian government was doing everything it could to secure the release of my son and that it took allegations of torture very seriously. That promise was nearly 5 years ago. Since then, the government has done precisely nothing to secure Jack's release. They have, in fact, actively prevented and opposed it. After the return last month from Syria of 2 Canadian women and 2 children, we have discovered that one of those women could have been rescued by a former US diplomat with the assistance of a US military jet 8 months ago, but that access to her camp had been deliberately blocked by the Canadian government. It's difficult to understand why the government is insisting on keeping Canadian citizens, including children, in torture conditions. It's torture for the detainees and also for their relatives who are forced to watch and wait helplessly from the sidelines. It's shocking and incomprehensible to me that when I asked the Foreign Ministry if I would be told if Jack were no longer alive, they replied they could not guarantee this information would be relayed to me. The sheer cruelty of this is beyond belief. I would like Prime Minister Trudeau to read some of the comments from the 12,500 people who have signed our petition to free the 40-plus Canadian citizens from unjust imprisonment in Syria. Once people have become aware of the atrocious internment conditions and of the fact that their government is falling behind almost all European countries in repatriating their citizens, they are shocked that this situation is permitted in a democracy. They are joining family members in calling upon the Canadian government to repatriate everyone, men, women, and children, without delay. Jack's freedom from an inhuman dungeon is only possible via the intervention of Foreign Minister Melanie Joly. Canada has been invited by the Kurdish administration to pick up our citizens. All we have to do is send a delegate over there to sign a handover form and issue travel documents. We've seen from last month's repatriations that this is not too difficult or too impossible, as the government falsely claimed before. This morning, I am attempting to deliver a birthday card for Jack to Melanie Joly in the House of Commons, since our family has no other way of communicating with him. His fate and that of all the other 40-plus detainees lies in her hands. Thank you.
Over to Monia.
Bonjour. Today, I am joining my voice to some Canadian politicians, human rights activists, and families who are worried about the rights of other Canadian citizens detained abroad. We are worried to see the rights of Jack Letts and 43 other Canadians being disregarded, ignored, and abandoned. Since 2017, there are 44 Canadian citizens who are held in northeast Syria by the Kurdish forces. They are held in conditions similar to torture. It is estimated that there are 24 Canadian children, most the age of 7 years and under, unlawfully detained in these camps and prisons. Fionnuala Ní Amháin, the UN Special Rapporteur for the protection and promotion of human rights while countering terrorism, has put Canada on a list of shame because it won't take active steps to repatriate its foreign nationals trapped in the Kurdish-controlled camps in northeast Syria. Why is the government of Canada doing nothing to bring back its own citizens home? Worse, why is Canada putting obstacles for families of Canadians who are trying to bring their own loved one back home? Where is Madame Melanie Joly? Why doesn't she stand up for the right of Canadian children? Where is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who once declared a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian? Why doesn't he stand up to bring Jack Letts and 43 other Canadians detained in northeast Syria? In the past 2 decades, I was personally involved in cases of Canadian citizens left on their own overseas by their own government. Meher Arar was tortured and detained in Syria for over a year. Meanwhile, the Canadian government failed to support him and bring him home. We watched incredulously the case of Abu Sufyan Abdulrazik stuck in Sudan while the Canadian government refused to issue him a Canadian passport and remove him from a terrorist list where he didn't belong. We have seen the same pattern over and over unfold in the case of Omar Khadr, who spent over a decade detained in Guantanamo, and meanwhile the Canadian government persisted in not repatriating him, fearing a public opinion backlash. Enter former American Secretary of State Hillary Clinton admonished the Canadian government to take their own Canadian citizen back. Recently, the American government offered help and support to Canada to repatriate its citizen from northeastern Syria. What is Canada is waiting to take this offer seriously and cooperate with the American and bring its own citizen back home. The families are waiting, the world is waiting, justice is waiting to be served. Merci.
We'd like to close today's gathering with a few questions for the Canadian government, specifically Melanie Joly, Global Affairs Minister, but also the Public Safety Minister, the Prime Minister, and the Minister of Immigration. Question number one, how can your government justify exiling 40-plus Canadian Muslim men, women, and children under the very same arbitrary detention you so rightfully condemned when your government played a role in creating an international agreement on ending arbitrary detention. Another question, why is your government so selective in choosing the cases of Canadians detained abroad that it will advocate for? How can our government be spending $3 million to repatriate Iraqi citizens, which is a good thing, at the same time that you are going to court to prevent the repatriation of Canadian citizens? Countries with far fewer resources than Canada's have repatriated hundreds of their nationals. Why is Canada playing the role of an outlier on this issue? Why this week, just down the road from here, is Canada and the federal court scheduling a secret hearing absent these families and their lawyers to discuss this issue? How can this government tout the rule of law when we have been found by the United Nations to be complicit in the arbitrary detention of Jack Letts and the other detainees? We also ask, why is it that this government has failed to act on an all-party recommendation of a 2021 parliamentary committee that called for repatriation, very similar to the repatriation calls we've seen from the International Committee of the Red Cross, the United States State Department, the Kurdish detainers themselves, and the Red Cross? Why won't global affairs officials sit down with Sally Lane, sitting here, who's been seeking a meeting for 3 years and lives a 10-minute walk from global affairs? Canada was within 1 week of repatriating its citizens in 2018, and then everything stopped. And we have to ask, why? There was a report produced by Human Rights Watch in 2020 called Bring Me Back to Canada, and they interviewed Dr. Abdul Karim Omar, who is the co-chair of Rojava's Foreign Relations Commission. And he said at that time that Canada was the very first country to be in touch regarding repatriation in 2018. But in 2020, when he was interviewed by Human Rights Watch, he said, quote, Canada sent us application forms and travel document papers. Canadians detained in northeast Syria filled out all of it, and we sent back scanned versions. We got to the point of them coming to pick up their citizens, then everything stopped. We don't know why. That was 2 years ago. We would love a meeting with Canada on this issue. So today we're seeking clarification of the reasons behind this apparent change in position from the Canadian government on repatriation. And we're also seeking an assurance that Canada will now take steps to facilitate repatriation of all of its suffering citizens in camps under conditions described by the United Nations as tantamount to torture, including 20+ children. 40 Canadians are suffering through these conditions. They must be brought home immediately. Canada must stop its opposition to the court case seeking their repatriation. I'm Matthew, and Tim and Alex are here, who have been involved in these kinds of issues for many years and can certainly speak to the ongoing patterns of Canadian complicity in human rights abuses that we've seen. I think we have a couple of minutes for that, so if you gentlemen would like to add a few words, that would be fantastic.
Certainly. I'll just say the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group is a coalition of 45 Canadian organizations. For the past 20 years, we've worked to defend the rights of Canadians during the War on Terror, and in situations like these, our 45 members stand up and are appalled that the Canadian government has not done more and has not immediately acted to bring home these 40+ Canadians who are detained in northeastern Syria. As Monia so powerfully pointed out, we have seen these cases time and time again. Time and time again, the government has been proven to be in the wrong for ignoring the rights of these Canadians and for allowing them to be detained in situations akin to tantamount to torture, and in many cases, situations of torture itself. These Canadians must be brought home. There are no clear answers as to why the government isn't acting. It's an issue of political will. We've seen, as Matthew said, so many countries without the resources of Canada bringing their citizens home. We need to see it happen now. We can't understand. We have heard nothing from the government in terms of why this delay continues. I'll pass it over to Alex.
It is absolutely clear what needs to happen here. No matter whether you are concerned about justice and the rule of law, whether you are concerned about upholding security, whether you are concerned about the integrity of Canadian citizenship, whether you are concerned about the ongoing turbulent, heartbreaking situation in Syria itself, or whether you are simply concerned about protection of universal human rights. And I would suggest we should be concerned about all of those imperatives. And all of it points to only one outcome here. Repatriation must be facilitated as quickly as possible. There's no more space for inaction. There's no more excuses for silence, and there certainly is no justification for obstructing and putting up barriers in the face of what needs to happen here. We need to see action, and we need to see it now.
Okay,
Merci.
thank you
Nous
very
sommes
much.
prêts pour
I
les
think
questions.
we'll move to questions. Yeah, okay, we'll move to questions. If you're on the Zoom platform, please raise your hand. We'll begin with a question in the room. Ian Wood, CTV.
Yeah, good morning. Just last month, there were 2 Canadian adults and 2 children repatriated. 2 of them faced, the 2 adults have been facing criminal charges. We talk about the rule of law in these repatriations. Potentially, some people could face charges on return to Canada. Is that something that everyone is open to facing with regard to repatriating these citizens from abroad, these camps in Syria? Maybe Elizabeth May, you might be able to answer that first as a legislator here.
Well, Ian, thank you for the question. I think it's really relevant to know that none of the people, that none of these 44 have been charged or convicted of anything. So we need to know that, yes, any Canadians repatriated from the current situations are going to be, if there's allegations and evidence of wrongdoing against those individuals, they should face justice here. But as someone who, en tant que mère, c'est pas imaginer pour moi d'imaginer la situation là de l'heure de mon amie Sally. Elle a dû endurer à cause de notre décision de repatriation. So I think really Sally and Matthew and Monia and Alex should speak to this if you can briefly.
Say that as a family member, me and my husband have said for years that if there is any evidence against Jack, that he should be allowed to have a fair trial. He should be allowed to speak for himself. He shouldn't have to be defended by his mother in press conferences while he is held in a black hole, incommunicado, unable to defend himself at all for the past 5.5 years. It's a very, very, very long time. The Canadian government was about to repatriate him in 2018. And as Matthew said, we have no idea why that was called off. The British police have told us that there's no evidence that he has done anything wrong. But John and I, my husband, have always said, let him speak. Let us hear if there is any evidence against him, and if there isn't, let him go free. But leaving him in a legal limbo, no access to a lawyer, no access to the outside world, not able to speak to his family, us not even knowing if he's alive, is just shocking, incomprehensible, and undemocratic.
Maybe if I can just add, as Sally and Elizabeth pointed out, none of these Canadians have been charged or with a crime. There has been no evidence produced of their involvement in crimes. They face no prospect of trial while they are detained. They are indefinitely detained. And so to leave people just to waste away in these camps and in prisons under these vague allegations without any evidence is contrary to human rights law. It's contrary to the commitments that the Canadian government has made for its citizens and made internationally. If they do return, when they do return to Canada, the Canadian government, as you mentioned, has taken action against individuals they believe participated in criminal activities. We would be concerned that because of the allegations against them, we wouldn't want to see people treated more harshly or treated with suspicion simply because of allegations against them. But if there is evidence, and clearly Canada has laws. But as was also said, many other countries with much less resources than Canada have brought home many more people from Syria and have been able to adequately ensure that these people are, reintegrated into society, provide the support that they need, and that the security of their neighbors and communities are protected as well. And so we don't understand why Canada can't do the same. We believe Canada can do the same and must act. And then, the first and foremost priority is ensuring that people aren't left to simply waste away for the rest of their lives, essentially right now, in these detention camps.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the United States is never shy when it comes to prosecuting human beings who come from that part of the world. You can call it Islamophobia, you can call it whatever you want, but people of Islamic faith tend to face far more prosecution than anyone else. And the U.S. knows exactly who's in those camps, and I think they've already extracted the individuals they're looking for. There was a group that was actually put on trial in Virginia last year. So for the United States, which is interested in prosecuting individuals, for them to be saying, everybody else, send them home, I think that sends a really powerful message about the fact that a lot of the people who are in these camps are not individuals who have been involved in criminal activities. Many of them are displaced people who happened to be in that area when it was taken over by Daesh, and they were fleeing from Daesh when they were captured by the Kurdish officials, including many of the detainees whose families we are in touch with.
Needs to be a more coordinated attempt than with Canada and other nations involved, because it's not just Canada that is not repatriating these citizens. In fact, some European countries have taken the same position. Some European countries have even taken away the citizenship, including Mr. Letts. So does there need to be a more coordinated international approach then?
If Alex Neve has more of a finger on what the other countries are doing and whether we should coordinate better with them.
I think international coordination can often be helpful as long as it is focused on the right outcomes and objectives. I think here what is notable is that Canada has been a laggard when it comes to the international response, that there's a growing number of other countries that are showing they get it, that they recognize that both rights and justice require taking action here and facilitating repatriation. Certainly, there are ways in which states could and should be assisting each other towards that goal, but inaction and staying on the sidelines is certainly not consistent with that at all.
It's also worth pointing out that the Kurds have been very clear. Canada sends a delegation, they sign the papers, they provide travel documents, and they get escorted out by the United States. That's what happened last month. So there is a template for doing this. It is something that is absolutely doable. The Canadian government is just refusing to do it.
I would just add that, since your question is directly to me, Ian, I think it's unconscionable that we would rather leave people in situations of torture with no rights and no contact and no medical help. They're in peril. I'd rather see any one of them, right down to the tiniest baby, in a Canadian jail than dying in a hellhole in Syria.
Okay, we'll move to the Zoom platform. Jim Bronskill, Canadian Press.
Hello. My question is about the federal court proceedings that are coming up. Perhaps you could comment on the state of those and just the fact that you've had to take that step in federal court to have a response and some action from the government.
hearing will be on the 5th and 6th of December. That's the public hearing that follows the secret hearing that will be held sometime, we don't know when, before that in November. And families have been forced to take this step because we have received nothing but lies and excuses from Global Affairs Canada. And so we are having to take the government to court. And they are fighting the repatriation of 20 children, 13 women, and 8 men, which is against all human rights legislation. It's against the Canadian Charter of Rights, and it's against the recommendation of the UN, who said that Canada is actually complicit in the torture of their own citizens in illegal detention. And so, yes, we are waiting for that hearing to happen, and what we're hoping is that the judge will order immediate repatriation of everybody.
Jim, I'd like to just add that we've just received the submissions of the federal government in the federal court case, and they are appalling in as much as they are completely disavowing their responsibility for any of these Canadian citizens. They are leaving them in a state of exile. And the whole case that has been brought against them, which has hundreds and hundreds of pages of evidence, has been dismissed by the federal government as irrelevant to the proceedings. And 3, there's a secret hearing going on this week in which Sally is not allowed to be there, her lawyer is not allowed to be there, none of the families are allowed to be there. What is the Canadian government claiming national security secrecy about? Could it have anything to do with the same things that it has declared national security confidentiality about in the past, i.e. covering up human rights violations, i.e. covering up Canadian complicity in torture, covering up perhaps CSIS's role in the trafficking of young British women into the Syrian war zone? There's a great number of questions that need to be answered regarding these cases, and it appears that the Canadian government doesn't want any of them to be shared with the Canadian public, much less of an open, fair, and transparent federal court hearing.
Just a quick follow-up. Yes, the secret proceedings are happening. Is there any sense that this might delay the actual main hearing scheduled for next month?
No, the court has been very clear. We're proceeding in public on December the 5th and 6th, and I'll turn it over to Alex.
Well, I was just going to add that it's unconscionable that this group of Canadians has had to turn to court in the first place for something as simple and obvious as expectation that their government will uphold their rights. And then on top of that, it is disgraceful that it has now become shrouded in legal tactics and secrecy as a way of obstructing and slowing down those court proceedings. It is not too late. It is never too late for the government to do the right thing here, which would be, of course, to withdraw its opposition to the court proceedings, but more importantly, take the steps that are necessary and simply agree to facilitate repatriation.
Okay, last call. I don't see any other raised hands. If you have a question, please raise your hand. That's all the questions we seem to have. Thank you very much.
Can we just add today that it's important that we hear from other members of Parliament. We've only had 2 members of Parliament in all of Parliament speak out about this, and we really appreciate Elizabeth May speaking out, and Heather McPherson, who had to unfortunately pull out this morning, but she issued a very strong statement in June calling for repatriation as well. Where are the voices of all those human rights standard bearers in Parliament? Where are the voices of the interfaith groups across this country? Where are the children's rights advocates who seem to be missing in action here when there are children who are so nutritionally deficient that they are forced to eat sand in these camps. Some of them are suffering a form of pleurisy, which is similar to that which we saw during the Dust Bowl because of the great dust storms that roll across the Syrian desert and completely envelop these camps. Folks are being held in just remarkably dire conditions. There are tent fires. Children play, some of them fall into human waste cesspools. There is no medical assistance. There's no educational programming for these children. Where are the voices? We really need to hear from you so that you can put pressure on the Canadian government to do the right thing and bring everybody home.
Okay, thank you very much. That concludes today's press conference.
Thanks, the press gallery as ever. Thank you.